The white liberal is the one who has perfected the art of posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor. In this political football game, the white liberal is able to use the Negro as a pawn or a weapon.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Black Radicals. In this interview, we speak with Emmaia Gelmen on her book, The Anti-Defamation League and the Racial State. While the history in this book mostly covers events in the US, the book is expansive in its critique of elite class interest and its relationship with racism, whiteness, the various waves of European Jewish immigration, and the role of anti-Semitism. The book also covers the myth of an elite Jewish-Black alliance, suggesting instead that there is an anti-racist alliance between working-class Jewish people and Black people, but the ADL demands Black populations to be grateful for the ADL's role in Black liberation is based on a myth. Find out more about this interesting history, the origins of the ADL and its relationship to German Jews in Emmaia's new book. At the hour's mark of this interview, I used Jason Arday's treatment by the media as an example of racist attack on Black life to preserve white supremacy. We deliberated whether to include this part of the interview or not, due to the interview having taken place before what I consider to be the murder of beautiful Black life. We decided to include it and extend our solidarity to Arday's family, his children especially, his loved ones, and his friends. This type of solidarity always comes too late, and may Arday's children know of it and boldly live in beautiful Blackness. And with that, I hope you enjoy today's episode.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, the ADL, in case people are not familiar with it, it's a major U.S. political institution that has a hand in lots of different things. Like it does a lot of media work, it does legislative advocacy, it puts curriculum in schools. It's like the organization that's on speed dial anytime there's an incident of anti-Semitism, which we'll talk about what the ADL means by anti-Semitism, but also it has been on speed dial for any time there's an incident of racism, including like anti-Muslim racism or anti-Black racism. That's kind of over right now, like in the last year. Just put a pin in that, hold on to that idea. So it is over 100 years old, and its kind of formation, I mean, it calls itself a Jewish organization, as so often political organizations do that are trying to sort of rationalize themselves as a grassroots organization when they're really not, or as a kind of representative of a whole ethnicity or like racialized group of people. And so the ADL is understood in US politics as a Jewish organization, which is a mask for many other things. And its conservative politics have really been on full display in the course of the genocide. And so people have started to be interested and think about it in that way. And I'll try and knit all the pieces together. But this book is a history of the ADL as a political organization since its inception. And it turns out that it's actually like the stuff that's happening now in the context of the genocide, where I'll be more explicit, the ADL is driving anti-Semitism statistics. It's sort of the main voice saying like, oh, there was a protest against genocide, anti-Semitism, and it produces reports saying like anti-Semitism has spiked by 3,000% or whatever, which becomes then the material basis for saying things like we must send weapons to Israel to continue flattening Gaza and bombing Palestinians. So it has very material effects through this sort of cultural mode. But it turns out that if you look at the ADL's history, it's not really correctly described as just a Jewish organization. It's an organization of the Jewish upper classes. And that is very significant because one of the sort of main images in US history of US Jewry is the arrival between at the turn of the century, between 1880 and 1920, about the arrival of millions of Jews from the Russian Empire fleeing persecution and moving into like labor organizing and social justice organizing because of their experiences of persecution and their experiences of socialist and communist and anarchist organizing in Europe. That's such a key piece of how US Jewish history is seen because 2 million people showed up that way, including my grandparents. But the ADL didn't come from that. The ADL
Right.
came from a much smaller and earlier immigration of German Jews, Central European Jews, who had established themselves in the United States as part of the settler colonial structure. They had come out of German colonialism and the sort of European colonialism of their time in the 1800s. They were white supremacists, not in a special way, just in the way that Central Europeans were and that white settlers in the United States were. And they established this sort of upper class state supporting organization that did identify itself as Jewish. But then when Jews came who were not part of that sort of culture and ethos, the ADL became kind of like the police disciplining those Jews and trying to make sure that their politics never took root. So it's a long way of saying that this is a history of the ADL that tries to understand it as a US political organization that comes out of conservatism and wealth, moving from settler colonialism into anti-communism, and then policing anti-colonial movements worldwide. And it's sort of the author of the idea, or I mean, not solely, right, but a main author of the idea that anti-colonialism is extremism, right? And now they've equated it with terrorism, and now they've sort of made this link between anti-Semitism, which they refer to as any kind of opposition to essentially Western supremacist power and Israeli genocide. They've connected that to terror. There's no short summary, sorry, because it's 100 years. But that's what the book is about. I started writing it 10 years ago. It was my graduate research because I was doing anti-occupation organizing at the time. It was, before we understood it as anti-apartheid, anti-Nakba, anti-genocide. And the ADL was always in there being like, oh, we're the civil rights and social justice organization. P.S. Palestinians have no rights, leftists have no rights, etc.
Can you tell us a little bit, maybe the history, the beginning history of like, what kind of, who populated the sort of, I don't know, the people who started the ADL, or like what kind of circles they were in, or what kind of politics they had, basically?
The ADL was an outgrowth of an organization called B'nai B'rith. This is all, it's like a very US centric history, but it becomes a global history. So when Central European Jews arrived to the United States, they weren't like destitute or marginal in other ways. And B'nai B'rith was this sort of network of lodges. The idea was to promote business, become part of the industrialization class. A lot of the ways that population of immigrants made their fortunes was through settlement. So, for example, like bringing trade to the frontier, the edge of settlement where land was being conquered, but there was no commerce yet. That sort of trade and peddling even translated into the development of major warehouses, business infrastructure, and banking. And there were also people who had brought their resources from Germany and from Central Europe as well, who were connected to the banking industry there. So they were the upper classes, and they understood themselves as white. They were received as white. Their view was that Judaism was a religion, not a racializing or ethnic group. They really identified with the settler project. In the very early years of the ADL, its leader was referring to Jews who were on the left as apostates. And he didn't only mean apostates in Judaism, he meant apostates against the kind of settler religion of liberal capitalism.
Okay, tell us about the Jewish migration that, were perhaps in the majority, the ones who came from like, resistance, and the ones who had like fled the pogroms and so on and so forth. What happened to them, and how did they interact with, this is, let's say, established business class, or whatever, when they did come to the US, and how were they received, and the antagonisms between them, if there were any?
Because the United States has had so many waves of immigration, often what has happened is that the first wave, becomes established, and then the next wave is much poorer. Like the circumstances that send people are much different. It's not special to Jewish immigrants, right? It's like Irish immigrants, Indian immigrants. It's happened over and over again. The Jews who came as refugees, many had the experience of resisting the czar. And being organized as Jews through the Bund, but on the basis of class, right? Or on the basis of anti-imperialism. And immediately their leftist politics and anti-state politics made them an enemy of this earlier set of immigrants. And that's actually why the ADL was formed and the American Jewish Committee, which is another major political organization, because they, although they had been saying like we're no different from other white people, from other Americans, they said Americans, but they meant white people, right? When the second wave of Jews arrived and they were getting ready to form organizations, they're like, we need representation, because they had been represented in Europe by organizations like the Bund. When the elites understood that that was happening, their response was like, oh, no, no. If anyone's forming organizations, it's us. And so they formed the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, the vast network of charities called the Jewish Federations, and which still is centralizing the funding that's called Jewish funding. The kind of coherence of those networks as not just elitist, but also capitalist and state supporting organizations and imperialist organizations has become very important, because now the entire structure of US Jewish life, if you look at it in terms of its institutions, is quite conservative, except in the ways that the Jews who have always been left out are now resisting more and more. We talk a lot about Jews in this context, and I just want to be clear that the trajectory of these organizations is, of course, closely tied to the ways that Jews emigrated and moved up the economic and corporate ladder. But the work that they're doing is on race writ large and imperialism writ large, because these organizations are talking about policing, they're talking about housing, they're talking about how the United States conducts foreign policy and what industries are developed. So it's wrong to understand them just as Jewish organizations. They're US political organizations deeply embedded in a racial state and with a very clear ideological commitment to the whiteness of the racial state.
You are right, like it's generations of like migrants from, different different ethnicities and backgrounds come. There is a certain antagonism, and we were talking about this like off camera or off recording. And for example, from the Sudanese community, you have people who might have been established even back home in Sudan, for example, who their parents are wealthier, or like they went to like you know certain schools or whatever. And then when they do come to I don't know, let's say America and England, or Germany, or whatever, there is a distance between them and the new arrivals, or people who are poor, or people who even like attained citizenship through like a refugee or like asylum seeking and stuff like this. And it reflects, I think, also, at least preliminary, like or anecdotally, it seems to reflect like race. I don't know how, like a certain racial dynamic within Sudan itself. People from Darfur are seen in a different light, and so on and so forth. However, here the second part about this is like you mentioned how these organizations, the ADL and such, should not be seen as exclusively like Jewish organizations, because like they talk about how to train police to be like less racist. They have like sort of influence on like some decades ago about like education systems and so on and so forth. I'm wondering, how do you understand this as like coincidental that they came to like like they managed to use like these organizations to be like almost like an umbrella for like discrimination and like racism? Is there a story behind it? Like, how should we understand it, or how do you understand it?
It's such a good question, because, of course, Jews are always protesting these organizations, right? Like when I say that it's not fair to call the ADL a Jewish organization in the way that it says, like it says it represents Jewish interests. Like, no, it doesn't. Jews hate the ADL, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like recent polling by the Jewish Federations of North America, the charity network, shows that only 37% of American Jews identify themselves as Zionist. The rest, not everybody's anti-Zionist, but it's not true that those organizations represent Jews. On the other hand, let's not play historical denialism, right? The way that the ADL was formed has everything to do with the pathways of Jewish immigration to the United States, the ways that Jews were incorporated into whiteness because they were European identified, right? The fact that they had ties to European capital matters, and it's not divorced from their Jewishness. So I don't want to deny that they're Jewish organizations, but at this point, they're using Jewish identification as an alibi for all kinds of things that have nothing to do with Jewishness. And the question of how it happened is a matter of the formation of what I call in the book the state capital class, which is actually a multiracial class at this point. It borrows from David Harvey's idea of the state capital nexus, meaning that there's no way to really separate out corporate capital and the infrastructure of finance from the way that a state operates, right? Not only do states use and depend on privately owned capital to do their work, but they also use the relationships that they have with people who control capital and the culture among those people that keeps them in line, that says, like, the CEO of Exxon is not going to fund the resistance. Like, that's a cultural fact. So the movement of that early set of German Jews into the state capital class by bringing capital, in some cases from Germany, and also by achieving economic success in the United States through participation in settlement, in some cases slavery, not all cases, and through capital and industrialization. So they become part of this class of people, which is a governing class. They still are, right? The ADL is not a membership organization. It's run by a board. I actually don't know how many people are on the board, but if you look at it, it's all wealthy people. That's been the case since the beginning. People who control money, who have high-level professional jobs, control foundations, and they are closely integrated with other people in power who are not Jewish, right? So it's not a Jewish thing. The last piece of it is that a lot of the people who had arrived as leftists from Russia are no longer, like, that left has been diminished, partly just through constant invitations to participate in the white supremacist and state capital class. If you want to have a nice house, you move into a white neighborhood. If you want to impress your business friends, you go to an ADL dinner and you make a very big public donation. And then there's also the invitation into white supremacism that comes from not wanting to be associated with Blackness, not wanting to be associated with immigrantness. The left has been racialized. Opposing the police is racialized. And so if you want to be included, be white, be American, then you have to shit on the left, basically. So, a Sudanese doctor who, as you were saying before we started recording, might say, I don't want to associate with other Sudanese people, or, I'll stick with elite spaces, is seeking to reverse, and maybe hoping that it's working, some of their racialization through the performance of class and access.
So there's like a Sudanese person that we knew, and they came from Sudan, but they have family here. And she herself is a doctor. The family here, they're doctors. They live in like this, this fuck off big mansion here in like somewhere in Germany. So that's their backgrounds. And I remember she used to say that she had to, because when you're a refugee, you're limited to a certain area. And then you can, sort of petition and be like, well, I have family in this area, so can I go there, and all that kind of stuff. And then when I spoke to her, she would say something like, man, the Sudanese people, man, they don't know how to behave themselves. They should be like sort of more accepting. Or like Syrians, they've like sort of fucked it up for us because like they don't know how to behave themselves. They haven't like integrated and stuff like this. And we were talking about it. I guess this goes back to the question that I asked previously, which is like, I understand what she's saying from an integrationist logic, integration into, you might say, like, the normalization of like Western supremacy or whatever it is. When it comes to, these Jewish organizations, or not exclusively Jewish organizations, but like what they identify as Jewish organizations, anti-Semitism, I don't know, it seems like anti-Semitism, they managed to make it, I think in one of the book, how I read it, I suppose it's like the defining feature of discrimination. How did that happen?
Yes, so this is about the centrality of the Nazi Holocaust to the ways that we now talk and think about racial justice. The idea that racism is bad really took root in the United States in response to Nazism. Biological racism, the idea of white superiority over Black people, Indigenous people, any colonized people, was disrupted by World War II and the understanding that racism produces global cataclysm. Racism is the sort of undercurrent, underpinning of colonialism and Nazism can't be, like, we can't survive that again. We have to uproot it. And because of that, anti-Semitism takes a central role, at least in US discussions, of racism as a kind of social ill. Anti-Semitism is specifically used as evidence that democracy is not healthy or that fascism is always latent because the theory is like it's always kind of sleeping and can be reawakened at any time. But of course, it's grounded in the erasure of other forms of racism. Like, yeah, this was a cataclysmic event. What about 400 years of slavery, right? Like, because slavery wasn't deemed cataclysmic to the world, it didn't touch white people. The question of how did the ADL become a voice on other forms of racism begins with the kind of sanctification of being anti-Nazi, and then it has to sort of pass through the civil rights movement era in the United States as well.
Can you move us through like to the era of like the civil rights and and how that related to basically, you know, the ADL and such organizations taking like such a key role.
The civil rights movement is another piece of history, like the history of the ADL, that's poorly understood. It's simplistically understood, which is always a killer with history. Of course, its roots are earlier than the 50s, right? Black sociologists in the United States were writing essentially the roots of racial capitalism theory already by the 40s, if not earlier. The civil rights movement initially sought to challenge the framework of racism by demanding equality. Like, I want to get on the bus and sit in whatever seat I want, no matter what race I am. I want to be able to drink at the same water fountain. These are demands that fit within the context of liberalism. They don't redistribute resources. Maybe they redistribute some cultural power. They were radical demands at the time that they were being made, but they didn't challenge the structure of the state. The ADL and the American Jewish Committee and other Jewish organizations, as they love to tell us all the time, supported those demands in many ways. The ADL pursued legislation and court cases, non-discrimination laws in housing and employment, for example. But they were very committed to law and order and to the state itself. For example, the ADL frowned on things like protests, the famous sit-ins in the South where Black and white students went to integrate lunch counters. And they objected to them because they were against the law, very simply. They objected to street protest because it was disorderly. And their version of how political change is made is like, you know, one powerful guy goes to another powerful guy and says, we have this little problem. Do you think you can help us solve it? Mass movements terrified them because they were elitists as well. And additionally, any whiff of what they called communism, which really means, you know, leftism or challenge to capitalism, was horrifying to them. Affirmative action is a good example of that. So open up universities to people who have been denied. In fact, Jews used to be denied access to universities. Now who's denied is people of color. But no, we don't want to hold places for people of color who have been denied entry to university now because that's read as taking something away from white people, which now includes Jews. So their role in the civil rights movement was initially supportive. And then as the civil rights movement actually began to challenge white supremacy, basically, and to challenge capitalism, then they began to oppose it and call it extremist. But when we talk about like, oh, the ADL was a civil rights organization, people are talking about like 1962. You know, it's like as if the rest of it never happened. So it gets confused as a civil rights organization because it once participated, basically. And of course, in the United States, if there's a white organization that's saying that it is an authority, the state is going to gravitate toward that organization. The state doesn't want to talk to a Black organization that might say something untoward and be more challenging.
Maybe my question is because I find it all fascinating. I mean, there are maybe elite Black institutions, whatever, but it is a persistent thing that, you know, they stood, you know, these what they self-identify as Jewish organizations stood side by side with like, black organizations for like black power and freedom and civil rights and all of that. Can you tell us how big of a bullshit or maybe not that is?
You have to begin in the civil rights movement to understand this story. So the civil rights movement became kind of a cipher, a symbol for American democracy and progress, right? Like, we're not going to be Nazis, we're moving forward. And the way that we show you this is that the state itself has adopted the civil rights movement. In fact, there's a historian, Taylor Branch, sort of mainstream historian, who refers to Martin Luther King as a new founding father. Like, it's really an essential lens for everything. And following the civil rights movement, there has been this phenomenon that every demand for rights, women's rights, queer rights, immigrant rights to a certain extent, is represented through the symbolism of Black civil rights and Martin Luther King, right? That guy is carrying a lot. He's holding a lot.
R.I.P.
So for the ADL to continue to make the case that it is a pro-democracy organization, a progressive organization, it has to constantly refer to Martin Luther King and to Black civil rights. It can't proceed without that. And that's actually been a crisis for it for a long time, because in the 60s, the sort of key Black-led organizations that were talking about civil rights denounced Zionism as colonialism, and also ejected their white members and said, like, please go home and organize other white people. Like, we're not saying don't be in the movement. They were recognizing that their movements and their organizations were being forced to cater to white comfort in a way that was making it impossible to advocate for actual anti-racist change. And in the course of that, they also broke with the ADL. The ADL had been understood as part of the civil rights movement, and now it was being told to go home. And it was a crisis because it needed the legitimacy of being recognized as a partner by Black organizations in order to make its own claims, largely about Zionism at that point. It had just become Zionist. It had just sort of taken up Zionism as its project. And so you constantly see the ADL narrating its own claims using the civil rights movement as a sort of iconography. If I see that photo of Martin Luther King standing next to the chief counsel of the ADL one more fucking time, I'm gonna poke my eyes out. The only thing that saves me is that if you really look closely at that photo, you could just, if you just Google Anti-Defamation League and Martin Luther King, you'll see it. It's JFK, Martin Luther King, and then the person to King's left is Arnold Forster, who was the chief counsel of the ADL, but also like a major leader. And King is giving him such side eye. It's so delicious. Right? Look at it. He's like, what am I even doing right here, right now? I probably should have started with the story. There is this interview. Jonathan Greenblatt is the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. He went on this talk show, The Breakfast Club, with Charlemagne the God. And the reason that he's on The Breakfast Club, obviously, is to talk to its Black listeners. It's a hip hop radio show. It has like 8 million listeners. Vast majority are Black. He's talking to Black people. And the reason that he's trying to do this is because the ADL has been involved in this sort of attack on Kyrie Irving and Kanye West. No, Kanye West said some terrible anti-Semitic and Nazi shit. Like, I think we can acknowledge that Kanye West did that. Kyrie Irving had retweeted, I think, a film that had some conspiracy theories in it. Like, the man is a basketball player. Like, he's not a scholar, right? So he was told this is anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. He apologized for it. I mean, he pledged money to the ADL, and yet the ADL was still saying that's not enough. They were really going after him, and people were rightly pointing out that anti-Black racism is ignored, soft-pedaled, and anything that has a whiff of anti-Semitism, especially when it comes from Black people and especially Black people in power, becomes like an international incident. So people were accusing the ADL of being racist, which it is. And so Jonathan Greenblatt went on The Breakfast Club to make the case, essentially, as you're saying, that Jews in general, but the ADL in particular, like, has always been there with Black people. Like, we're the same, our experiences are the same. And in order to do it, he told this story, which the ADL often tells as its origin story, which is mostly not factual, that it was founded because there was a Jewish man who was lynched in Georgia in 1915. The story that Greenblatt tells is that a Jewish man was lynched, lots of Black people were lynched. Jews recognized that this was a sort of sameness and that we needed to fight this together. And so we created this organization whose purpose was to broadly fight racial discrimination. The ADL was founded in 1913. Let's begin there. The lynching happened in 1915. The Leo Frank
Right.
case does have something to do with the founding of the ADL, but the ADL was not founded because he was lynched. Solid, like straight up cap, like that is. The ADL was founded in response to the anti-Semitism that was being attached to this guy. They were calling him a pedophile, and there was lots of North-South stuff. But when he was lynched, the leaders of these organizations were afraid that it made Jews seem like Black people. It wasn't solidarity. It was racial panic. The question is, why is Greenblatt telling this story now? And the answer is that in order to legitimate itself, the ADL constantly has to narrate itself in relation to Blackness. You can watch that interview on YouTube. It's so uncomfortable. But also in the world of anti-racism, we don't go around saying like Jewish Black Alliance. We just do shit. We just do the work, right?
When we do talk about it, I think in these alliances, we talk about it almost like explicitly to fight off like this liberal racism, which is like, man, you know what I mean? I understand that, as a Jewish person during this time, like, I don't know, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff, but it's almost conscious. It's not because, oh, look, there's a Black person, let me go, or there's a Jewish person, let me go gravitate or hang out with them for some weird reason. But you mentioned something, the anti-Semitism industrial complex. I know you talked about it a little bit, but can you help us understand what it is and how you conceptualize it in the book?
Anti-Semitism industrial complex. The term, I think, first appeared in print and in theorization in an article by Heike Schotten and John Harfouche in the Journal for the Critical Study of Zionism. Power looks for mobilizing ideas, right? Any powerful political movement looks for the ideas that will mobilize people and resources. And that's true whether it's movements from below or movements from above, right? For organizations like the ADL, they have found that constructing a social problem that is called anti-Semitism, this idea that Jews are under attack mobilizes resources, and it mobilizes conservative resources. It mobilizes capital for war, for policing. It mobilizes policies that restrict speech. In the context of universities, what it has done is create openings for the ADL and some of its proxy organizations, I would say, like the Academic Engagement Network, which is another Zionist organization, to actually become integrated with university administrations, to have policy control or be in the ear of the policymakers all the time. The way that it works is that there's sort of parts of it. So a lot of it has to do with generating news and statistics and the claim that anti-Semitism is, a crisis. But in order to do that, there also has to be people reporting it. So there's this sort of solicitation of like, do you feel unsafe? Do you feel unsafe? Like, if you feel unsafe, report it. Here's a way to report it. But it's not only the sort of hyper collection. Also, there's a piece of it that precedes that, which is telling people that they're unsafe. It comes in lots of ways. There's reports that say Jewish students on campus are unsafe because there are protests. Of course, very deliberately glosses over the fact that lots of Jews are participating in the protests, that the protests are super, super careful and deliberately not anti-Semitic, not about Jews, that they're not actually harming people. But if I'm a new Jewish student going onto campus and I see a protest, I immediately assume that I'm unsafe because I've been told that that is unsafe for me. So then when the ADL asks me, have you been unsafe on campus? I check the box. And then the ADL reports, Jewish students don't feel safe on campus because they're anti-Semitic incidents. So it's this kind of circle. It's, of course, not limited to the ADL. In the last 15 years now, there has been a proliferation of organizations doing the same thing, setting themselves up to say they're anti-Semitism watchdogs, but in fact, attaching everything to a combination of Zionism and right-wing politics. So we might call that white grievance politics.
Yeah. Can I just make a note? Just think there is this Cambridge professor that currently getting like a lot of shit because of like plagiarism accusations, and you see like literally in the UK, sorry, and you see the fucking media just sorry, but you see the media just sort of like frenzying around this case, even though like other professors did, but all that kind of stuff. But it's almost like, oh, see, this is how we're going to like sort of implicitly like how this is going to degrade Western education standards and stuff like this, which is an attack on white supremacy. I just wanted to throw that as an example. Sorry.
And what it does is it creates the idea that it says sort of competition, right? A zero-sum game. Um, the context for all of this is that some people have power and some people don't. Some people historically have had access and others have not. And what this does is it sort of brings it into the present only, right? It extracts it from the context of the rest of the world. Like, okay, on campus, so you didn't get something on campus, but what's the global context in which we understand the resources and the privilege that you have? Putting everything through a pinhole, stripping away context, of course, is how the right works. It's how the genocide gets rationalized as a response to the Hamas actions on October 7th, right, in 2023. That if you see them through a pinhole, then everything else doesn't have to bear on it. If we still understood marginality through the lens of who has power and who's being dominated, of course, that wouldn't fly at all. It works also in Palestine, right? Like the idea that Palestine should be colonized and Palestinians should be genocided because Europeans were anti-Semitic. Like that doesn't make any sense, but it's a way of stripping context and creating a different sort of chessboard in which you only look at one thing at a time in order to reorganize the logic of it.
I know it's not explicitly in your book, but at least what I find interesting in your book is like it sort of complicates the relationship between even Zionism and like these sort of elite, these elite self-describing sort of Jewish organizations.
Yeah, I think that the key lesson there, I mean, there is a lot of discussion in the US of like, is Israel leading the US by the nose or is the US leading Israel? They're actually just in sympathy, right? They have shared goals. They are similarly colonial. For me, the overarching lesson about the ADL is actually that it started out as a settler organization, drawing on European colonialism. It has stayed in that form, whatever form that takes. It's fundamentally a Western supremacist organization. It's white supremacist, it's Western supremacist. Sure, maybe it makes some room for people who are not European white, but who are interested in occupying that place in a power structure, if we think about race as a sort of power structure. And so the United States and Israel don't have to, like, nobody has to lead somebody else, right? It's the same project. It's the same project. The idea that they are separate entities and that one is pushing the other, I think is a misunderstanding of how the state capital class works. They simply agree.
Okay, yeah, yeah. And I think it's important to say, I think especially today because, man, like, so I don't know, it's so widespread this concept where like Israel is like blackmailing, I guess it's like conspiratorial stuff, which is like, yeah, no one's blackmail. They're just comfortable, bro. Like, they're just pouring out over the genocide. It's like,
Because Palestine has clarified so much, right? Like there have been these sort of moments of clarification. In the US, the Black Lives Matter movement was a moment of clarification. People came to understand the concept of settler colonialism actually in a way that they hadn't previously understood. They came to understand racial capitalism, right? Like these are complex ideas that are now understood. And in the context of Palestine and the genocide, people's understanding that this is actually a global force. And even though it has elevated, say, for example, people like me, right? I, as they say, enjoy capitalism every day. I eat it for breakfast. It paved my roads. Even so, the ongoing development of colonialism and imperialism will kill me too. They're coming for me, right?
yeah.
There's an escalation that's really just clarifying how all of these things have always existed.
Do you think this turning point is like an end point? Is it a terminus point?
I don't know, the process of co-opting resistance movements over every historical moment is also pretty depressing, but I don't think we'll survive it if we don't fix it. So
Would you like to say anything before we leave? Any final comments?
because I study Zionist organizations and race and racism in the US, particularly as it relates to the imposition of racist genocide in Palestine, it is horrifying and fascinating to watch how Germany has moved through this. The ways that language of care and language of anti-racism has been repurposed by a fascist police force and a fascist state to repress.
So, here in Germany, when we talk, this anti-Semitism sort of is central in very particular ways. When I leave my house, for example, on the floor sometimes you have like these golden um, metallic pieces, and this is across Germany or across where West Germany, but like they have like names of sometimes persecuted Jews and so on and so forth. You have like the memorial culture is very very strong. You have even constitutionally, for example, you have laws like implemented that that are constitutionally like is fundamentally you need to fight anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism takes like a very central role here in Germany. This doesn't translate to racism, generally speaking. So, for example, Germany, just last year, for example, the University of Leipzig, one of the first times it sort of recorded racism, anti-Muslim racism, um, with, I don't know, government support, for example, or police violence and stuff like this. And even like it's not the same focus is not done in like other kinds. And even this particular focus on anti-Semitism, for example, it doesn't look at it like as like a form of like it's separate from racism. It's like it's not the same thing. It's not like a bad, like it's not classified within the same thing. In America, I feel that's a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean the discussion of anti-Semitism is both extracted from all other contexts, including like time and place. And it's discussed as eternal and always latent and always ready to pop back up, and exceptional, different from other forms of racism, but also because in the US, the civil rights movement, and the idea that the civil rights movement constituted the like the cure for racism is so strong. Discussion of anti-Semitism also has to be tied um, to that framework, and that's what's so in some ways interesting and so toxic about the ADL is that it rests all the time on its claim that it was a participant in the civil rights movement, not only a participant, but a sort of central figure in the civil rights movement. It points always to its collaboration with Dr. King. And yet in the present, it uses that to extract a sort of expertise on anti-Semitism that says that it's different and exceeds racism. You see that in the statistics, actually, the way that the ADL uses statistics to say anti-Semitism is like the most prevalent scourge. It's a little bit tricky because they say anti-Semitism is the most prevalent religion-based hate crime, and then of course, religion-based hate crimes are a small portion of all of the violence that's being measured, and the vast majority of it is anti-Black and anti-immigrant. But we don't get to talk about that because it gets extracted. I'm curious, though, in Germany, that's a very specifically US history that the ADL trades on. But the ADL is also sort of pumping this information into other places about the global scourge of anti-Semitism. So how does that land when anti-Blackness and anti-immigrant and other forms of racism are not given that kind of central place in German culture? Like what is the sort of moral authority that the anti-Semitism scare is resting on for you?
Honestly, for me personally, I'm not sure. It's funny because I think maybe counter to what many people say when it comes to questions of race, America is a little bit more progressive. I know this sounds wild. That's a wild claim, but I'm not talking about like progressive in action. I'm talking about discursively, like purely discursively. Of course, action is not it's a little bit different. But okay, so how does that, what does that mean for me? Honestly, here in Germany, because of what I said earlier, racism just does not exist. We're like fully a post-racial society. And even like right now with like the threats of like the AfD and all these kinds of things, you see people come saying that, oh, we don't recognize, this is a German party that we don't recognize, it's so racist, it's so this, and this is not like us. if you ask any immigrant in the street, like literally, just like anyone, you'd be like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Like it's just like they're saying the exact same thing that you guys are saying, but they're I don't know, they're just using maybe like an Nazi memory, even not even it's literally the same to varying degrees, of course. Um, but in the U.S., for example, what you pointed out, which I think is quite interesting, is how it tied to like what do you call it, the civil rights movement. And so I think I don't know. I mean, what do you think about this? Like, does this mean that it sort of symbiotically increased the discourse or like awareness about racism, or, like just because it's tied, or is it just completely fudged what racism is? I don't know.
I mean, what I have learned from looking at the history of the ADL and at political history of Zionism in general is that power seizes on any idea that's mobilizing, right? Like, there was a time when the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion was mobilizing. You say DEI, and suddenly people understand why we need to put money into this, or why, like why should we have this program? Um, and the civil rights movement, it is actually a real set of events, but it's also kind of like a conceptual field that, if you just like, it's like tapping the sign, right? So no, it doesn't actually produce more more remedy for racism. It produces more alibi, I think. It also gives us some ways to make demands. I mean, like the whole success of Black Lives Matter, I think, was contingent on saying like, well, we say civil rights, but civil rights has not happened, right? So this is a gap that needs to be addressed, and that's why we're marching, and that's why, like that's why fuck the police, right? It actually is a rationale. Um, but I don't know that it necessarily provides improvement. But so we had talked about how the ADL and the German Jewish immigrants who arrived in the US in the 1800s were bringing with them a sort of morality of their own that came from European nationalisms. But then obviously, like these things have diverged, like US history diverged and US nationalism diverged from European nationalism. So yeah,
Yeah.
what is that mobilizing idea in the sort of national context of Germany that like provides this pretend
Hmm.
post-racial morality?
I think like I would be interested because I think one of the things that so one of the periods that we talk about the divergence is obviously the civil rights moment, and also maybe perhaps after World War II, at least for in the US and in Germany. And I'm wondering from you, like, what do you think the diverge, like, what happened when like these separate, like Germany's the outpost, and then they separated, and then the divergence happens. Obviously, there's very different, social, political, and economic circumstances in both regions. Um, but for example, in Germany, the post-racial sort of society, I would imagine, happened like in the 50s or in the like after World War II in 45, um, and then this is sort of even consciously like the politicians try to make amends, and like in so doing they needed to make sure that they have nothing to do with like their Nazi past, and like it's a complete severance, a rupture from that society as a whole. And one of the ways in which they did so is basically the question of race is now sort of taken seriously, and like we're not like them, and obviously race is conceptualized in very sort of narrow ways, if at all. In my opinion, I don't think so, but in very narrow ways. But where do you think, like from where do you think like the points of departure from these two sort of I don't know, splits come from?
As you're speaking, I'm thinking about the various pieces of history that become the sort of sources of shame and and then supposed remediation. So the U.S. Um, comes into the post-Nazi Holocaust period with a sort of moral cleanliness, right? Like Germany, Europe, like that's where Nazism happened, and the United States doesn't have that. And the entire history of settler colonialism is just washed off the page, right? Like because that's not considered a sin, because settler colonialism is still embraced as a moral good, like settlement and industrialization and civilization. Um, so the US doesn't have that kind of foundational sin that it's remediating. Even slavery, it's not sort of addressing that. And so perhaps the we can like look at that post Nazi moment and say like, all right, well, as you're saying, like German society has to cleanse itself and say we've addressed that, and then that becomes a form of denial, right? But actually, the US does enter a form of denial, a period of denial. And that period is actually in the 70s, when the civil rights movement has developed out of the demand simply for formal equality, like I just want to sit where I want to sit on the bus, right? Or I want to live in whichever neighborhood can afford to buy a house in, and it moves into the more radical and Black Power sort of inspired dynamic of understanding that these are actually white supremacist systems that persist, and actually whiteness is not a racial category, but a category of privilege and a position within a power structure. And it's the discourse of Black power and white privilege that actually leads white people in the United States to begin to deny whiteness and to deny white privilege. And so interestingly, for Jews especially, who have spent the entire prior 3 decades entering into the social and economic upper classes and restoring that elitism that the ADL founders had when they formed the ADL, they start to say, actually, we're not white. Actually, remember this sort of history of our struggle and our exclusion. Well, you have to take that history and apply it to us now, right? There's this sort of ahistorical construction of a marginalized past. There's a really terrific sentence that is quoted. So this comes from Matthew Fry Jacobson's writing, but he's actually quoting somebody else that I can't remember who wrote about it in The Nation, which just says, everybody wants a shtetl to look back to, right? It's like everybody needs to point to their troubled roots and say, like, don't, pay no attention to my mansion, right? And this kind of denial, I think you may also, like, we might be able to compare it in some useful ways to German post-Holocaust denial of the fact that that's not resolved. So, yeah. I mean, I haven't made that comparison, so I don't know quite where it gets us, but I do think that the US didn't deny settler colonialism because it pretended it never happened, but it does deny whiteness in a way that's really key.
That's that part of the book I found quite fascinating. Like when I was reading it, I sort of, it was a moment of like, okay, so you occupy both whiteness and blackness at the same time, but in such an like you said, like such an ahistoric way, and it just justifies the continued oppression of it, like in the denial that you're talking about, right? Because like it's just not substantive. It's nothing. I think to compare it to Germany, I can use an anecdote. Maybe that's maybe interesting, which is like, so my wife and I, we're both practicing Muslims, and my wife wears the hijab. And so, naturally we have like a 2-year-old daughter, and like naturally she looks at her mom and goes like, well, can I try the hijab on? And just like children would do, like, can I try your, I don't know, slippers, or like, I don't know, like your skirt or whatever. So she's like, what's it called, trying the hijab on. And obviously as a parent, you don't want them to tell them that you can't do anything, or like this is wrong, or you don't want to, like, you know what I mean? I said, like, yeah, obviously, like, it's okay, yeah, you can whatever you want to do, you can do it. And then my wife tells me, like, whenever we go outside in the thing, you get so much stared at, and like statistically, you can have the social workers come in and say that this is like a form of like basically grooming children into like all that kind of stuff, and then simultaneously, like, you have like, I mean, we can go into this. But then, so like my wife goes into like she goes to university, and then she goes to like one of these classes, And there's this teacher or this professor who goes like, yeah, we need to be intersectional and we need to do this and all that kind of stuff, or like that cool stuff. And then I was like, yeah, especially in these times where like, the white supremacy of like this Western supremacy, white supremacy that's on display, like, and blah, blah, blah kind of stuff. It's like, oh, I don't think European is a white supremacist. Europe is like a white supremacist thing. And it's just, I use that example as just like the reality of what you're living in. You can, in the morning, basically take your child who is just curious about life and just worry that at any moment, like, someone can just call the social services. Yeah, just as a matter of fact, or like actual violence have happened and all that kind of stuff. And then in the afternoon, you can go to your classes and you're just like, the professor would just be like, yeah, we might have faults here and there, but like, all in all, it's okay. We live in a post-racial society. I mean, that's at least anecdotally, that's what I can think of. And obviously, I think why I'm just, sorry to go on a bit, but like I think why anecdote is like quite important for us here is because if the state is not monitoring these things in any meaningful way, and if the logic is basically we live in like a post-racial society, one of the only ways that you sort of understand what's going on, like the racial oppression that's going on, is like through documenting your own experiences and all these kinds of things. But yeah, I forgot where I was going with this thought.
Well, I
Yeah.
think that's actually, I mean, that's like the basis of scholarship. It's so important to think about the dissonance between what we're told and what we see. I mean, that's like how you start an investigation, right? Like that's essential. But it's the other thing that you're making me think of here is as I'm moving through the US and trying to help clarify what's actually going on. Like, we need to talk about what it means to be white. We need to talk about the fact that it's not a skin color, but like a trajectory and a history and a set of privilege. And we need to talk about how anti-Semitism fits or doesn't fit into the idea of marginalization, right? And the thing that's so missing from our conversations that I keep trying to add back is like the time and the place actually matter. You can't just look back to the shtetl and say at one point this happened, because context, race is relational and marginalization is about who has power in a given moment. And so of course, Jews in Nazi Germany were marginalized and and dominated, but that's not the case in the United States in the present, right? Like it feels like really basic, like that was then and there, right? And this is here and now, and we have to separate the two. But when there's denial of what is actually happening here and now, as you were talking about with the professor who's like, yeah, we're in a post-racial, egalitarian, non-white supremacist society, then how can you even have a conversation about what's happening now? And I guess that is the role of, to just bring it back to the ADL, like the ADL produces these anti-Semitism statistics that it then farms out into the media and become a really central part of US discourse, and actually also global discourse, and the discourse that's produced by the Israeli state, which also uses the ADL's numbers. And they're absolutely, they don't stand up to any kind of scrutiny. And yet they continue to circulate and they continue to set the frame. And they make it incredibly difficult to distinguish between racism, which is the sort of structural marginalization and exclusion and alienation of people, and whatever is happening in anti-Semitism right now, which is like, a hostility and perhaps like an ideological, or a religious based bias, but is not domination in the sense that we understand racism. Yeah. Anyway, so that's interesting to hear that level of denial. Maybe it's because I don't keep that kind of company. I don't hear that.
Yeah. But honestly, like I think for me it's also like it's a moment of reflection, I think, because you're right. Like the first thing is like, yes, of course there's a time, whether it's the Russian pogroms or whether it's like the German Holocaust or whatever, and those times these things like thing, but today it's not different time, and for different reasons. You know what I mean? It's not just like abstract, but like there's linkages. While I was reading your book, I think, or like a couple of days before, or so, like during that period, I saw like Pete Hegseth. He comes out on like national television and goes like, I don't know, we need to fight anti-Semitism in America, and we need to fight at like like obviously referencing like this Red Scare tactics and stuff like this, and it's really a surreal moment to see someone who is basically an open fascist, basic for all intents and purposes. You know what I mean? Like really which is one of many surreal moments. For example, the Elon Musk, doing the Nazi salute and so on and so forth, just simultaneously, like talking about defending Jewish people, and like we need to crack down on anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. I know many people have like many takes on this and stuff like this, but how do we make sense of it? Like, this is quite a bizarre situation, right?
There actually is the seed of it, I would say, is even in the book, which is that there is a real deliberate effort on the part of this German Jewish, like sort of German nationalist style American Jewish organizations to make the claim that Jews and Western civilization are the same, right? That Jewishness actually is an embodiment of the principles and ideas that undergird Western civilization. And even though they start this process they started in the 20s, and they really they crystallize it, I would say, in the 50s. And the part of the book, if anybody wants to look for this little section, is the dinner with the president with Truman in 1953, which is the first time that the ADL leaders actually assert themselves as a Jewish organization rather than Americanist organization, for the purpose of doing this, of saying like, actually Jewishness is special, and the way that it's special is that it's the same as American values, and we're that's why Jews and like Jewish organizations and the U.S. government are such good partners. And now we're actually seeing that be adopted both by conservative Jewish institutions like the ADL, and even like more avowedly right-wing Jewish institutions like the Tikva Fund, which is a long-standing neoconservative Jewish identified organization that's, I don't know, neoconservative is probably the best description of it. And more traditional right-wing organizations in the United States that adopt, like sort of racial supremacist ideals, but also anti-climate science, and this sort of, this sort of body of thought that's just overtly Western supremacist. Those organizations are actually gathering now in the last year or so to produce college and university courses that teach Western civilization and Jewish history together as the same thing. Right. And this is a direct response to Palestine solidarity organizing and anti-genocide organizing, and, critiques of Western supremacism that are happening on campuses. So that's how I make sense of it, is that this idea that the right and a certain strain of conservative Jewishness are partners, like it has Cold War origins. And, Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism are a very direct extension of the Cold War. And here we are in this moment when Marco Rubio says at the Munich Security Conference, we have to defend Western civilization, the anti-Semitism scare is part of that infrastructure. It's like the most anti-Semitic thing on earth. It's so awful. And yet it's so prevalent. And who's not objecting to it is the legacy Jewish organizations. They're eating it up. They love it.
But I mean, first of all, for the courses that they're doing, I hope there's no like experimental element of it. Otherwise, you're just gonna have like, I don't know what they're gonna do, genocide the population. I don't know what Western civilization.
They got something like a $10 million federal grant.
You're
for
joking.
This program. I'm not.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Oh, interesting. We'll see what the next generation or these graduates come out with. I think this is why I think your book is quite important, because like I said, there's a lot of takes to these things, to understanding like what's going on. What's this like, anti-Semitism, Red Scare kind of, goings on. And I think sometimes people say that it's the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And I think what your book tries to do is, well, that might be the case, of course, but you say, for example, it's not like these organizations from their inception were like somewhat, good, or like, they were doing the work that they were doing and so on and so forth. But rather, what we're talking about during this conversation is like, no, actually, they're partners in crime somewhat, like they're same, they have the same goals, they're the same, aspirations and so on and so forth.
What do you take from this look at how the ADL operated in the US, drawing on historical German nationalism? Like, does that tell you anything you already didn't know about how the anti-Semitism scare and racism are operating, and specifically anti-Palestinian racism, are operating now in Germany?
I mean, honestly, for me personally, like one of the main motivations of picking up this book is to better understand this schism of anti-Semitism, which is like, of course, like of course you're like all of us on the left are like anti, like we want to fight anti-Semitism, of course, wherever it is, or like any form of discrimination, not just like in a very specific way, but like just any form of discrimination. And I wanted to understand how fighting anti-Semitism has been in Germany, similarly in the US, but for our context in Germany, how is such has been such a violent racializing thing. Like it's been so violent. I mean, maybe this is a little bit too harsh. Maybe I'll cut it later or whatever. But honestly, when you see people coming out and talking about like we need to fight anti-Semitism, we need to do this, we need to do that, as a Muslim, as like a racialized person, you fucking back away. You're like, okay, you know what I mean? I'm not. This is clearly going to. And this has been my experience as well. It's like, yeah, it's just people who are so fucking violent and people who are so racialist and so racist. I don't know, like
No acknowledgement of the fact that that in the conversation or the physical process of supposedly confronting anti-Semitism, like who's getting hurt, like really hurt, is Muslims, Palestinians, people of color, and Jews, right? Like Jews who are standing on the same side of the line, right? And there's no acknowledgement that fighting anti-Semitism is producing incredible violence and repression, which is itself, like that's damning and troubling. Like if you're, I mean, this is not rocket science, like we say this all the time, like, but the idea that protecting Jews means harming other people is actually quite an anti-Semitic and fascist proposition, right? Yeah, I'm just
yeah.
doubling down. I haven't said anything you didn't say.
No, but you're absolutely right, and like like because for me it's like we're sort of grassroots organizations and stuff like this, and so we have a lot of these things happening at the same time, and you're just wondering, a little bit conscious about the space that you occupy, and like the kind of actions that you do and so on and so forth. And I like, it's confusing, like I like like I'm like, obviously, like I've only been here for 2 years, and like I'm originally from Sudan and stuff like this and all that kind of stuff, so like it's quite confusing. And then when you come to it and you sort of like read up, like that's one of the reasons why I picked up your book among others. When you read upon it, it's like there is a legacy and history about like this is this is something that is sort of reactionary, like it's something that's purposeful and something that is not just, it shouldn't be seen as like people are clumsy. You know what I mean? It's not something that there is a conscious effort going into like doing these things. And it's really like this, at least for my motivation for picking up the book, because whenever, honestly, it gets to a point where like whenever, for example, you go to like a pride march, for example, right? We go there, and it's my wife and I, and our child, and so on and so forth, and there's a small corner over there with like fighting anti-Semitism, and there's like the Israeli flag and stuff like that. And then as soon as you see that, it's like, yeah, okay, bro, this is just basically not for me. This, I don't know what, you know what I mean? Yeah, I don't know. It is just thoughts in my head, maybe anecdotes. But yeah, this is the reason why I picked it up, just to make sense of like this kinds of things which we kind of talked about.
Yeah, that we didn't even get into how weaving that kind of fascist approach to anti-Semitism into pride then is used to attack everyone who's like, now I don't want to participate in pride. Yeah. I think what you said, I just want to pull out what you said that was so meaningful to me, that this version of, supposedly fighting anti-Semitism is not simply clumsy. I think that's actually, I'm going to take that with me, because it is so important to understand the difference between something that's deliberate and something that's, simply produced by bad conditions or whatever. And yeah, I appreciate that. Just super appreciative of this conversation and of your thinking about it.
All these conversations, I think, are very important, and I think we have a moment to do something, and this moment is precipitated by the destruction of the genocide and the destruction of Palestinians, and it is incumbent on us to do something, anything. And so I think hopefully more conversations like this to come, and I'm really glad that you came on.
Thank you so much. Really, yeah. I'm glad to know you. Thanks.